Hello, and thank you for joining us for the presentation of Peacebuilding Fund's thematic review on youth, peace, and security. My name is Bushra Hassan. I am the Senior Monitoring and Evaluation Advisor at the UN Peacebuilding Support Office, and I'm delighted to be moderating for today's event. During the scheduled time for this launch event, our team had experienced some unexpected technical glitches. Therefore, we were unable to record our launch event. However, thanks to the positive feedback we have received, we are very, very happy to do a recording just for a very public-facing audience. We apologize for the inconvenience for those who tried to log in for the launch event, but we are also very delighted and appreciative of the research team and the youth panelists who came together again to record their insightful interventions and made them available to all of you. Just to give you a background on the thematic review, the PBF thematic review on youth, peace, and security was commissioned by the UN Peacebuilding Support Office in partnership with UNFPA, UNICEF, and the Climate Security Mechanism. Taking this opportunity, I would like to express our sincere gratitude to partners for supporting this research initiative. This study was led by UN University Center for Policy Research, including a team of young researchers. Thank you for your hard work, and you can see some of them on the screen. The review outlines programmatic best practices and lessons learned, drawing on examples from 41 PBF-funded projects spanning 33 countries and territories between 2018 and 2022. The review was also informed by field research in Central African Republic, the Gambia, and Guinea, and was based on 4 main cohorts or sub-themes of the YPS participation pillar. The first cohort focuses on youth inclusion in the local conflict prevention and peace building. The second cohort or sub-theme is on national or regional youth platforms. The third is on youth programming from an intersectional perspective. And the fourth is youth engagement in climate, peace, and security. We are very excited to be hearing today from the research team themselves with their presentation of the key findings and recommendations from the thematic review. This will be followed by a panel discussion with 4 young peace builders from Liberia, the Gambia, Sudan, and Tunisia, who we are very lucky to have today, and we'll definitely be benefiting from their experience. But first, let's watch a short introductory video about the thematic review, which tries to summarize some of the findings before then Erica guides us into a more detailed understanding of the report.
Around the world, young people are leading change, but too often they're left out of peace building. They face many barriers: stereotypes, intergenerational mistrust, poverty, unemployment, and limited financial resources for their initiatives. Many are shut out of political, civic, and economic life, even as they make up a growing share of the global population. To better understand how we can change this, the Peacebuilding Support Office in the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs commissioned a thematic review on youth, peace, and security, spanning 33 countries and territories. It offers practical recommendations for policymakers, practitioners, and donors. First, let young people lead by doing. Support them to lead community planning, launch media and peacebuilding campaigns, join or lead conflict prevention committees. Small grants or seed funding to youth-led groups go a long way, building their track record and breaking down harmful stereotypes. Second, combine peacebuilding with socioeconomic opportunities. Investing in youth entrepreneurship and skills training can create lasting impact and tackle the root causes of conflict. Involving youth in green jobs, like reforestation, beekeeping, and sustainable farming, can add up to a larger impact on conflict-sensitive climate adaptation. Third, make inclusion meaningful. Reach out to youth from all backgrounds, from different genders, ethnicities, faith, and experiences, from rural areas to cities. That includes young returnees, ex-combatants, migrants, and youth with disabilities. Inclusion takes time and thoughtful planning. Working with family members and community or religious leaders is key. Budgeting for protection measures and using accessible venues can also make a big difference. Creating space for youth participation at every level, local, national, and global, means starting with strong foundations and growing step by step. Youth aren't just the future, they are shaping peace now. Explore the full thematic review at un.org/peacebuilding.
Now, I would like to introduce our researchers and express our gratitude to the entire UNUCPR team for their hard work on this quite complex initiative. Dr. Erica Gaston is a senior advisor in UNUCPR's New York office and head of the Conflict Prevention and Sustaining Peace Pillar. She leads the center's work on peace and security, human rights, including as it relates to cross-cutting priorities such as women peace and security, youth peace and security, and climate peace and security, as well as other peace building and UN institution processes and reforms. Prior to joining UNUCPR, Dr. Gaston worked for over 15 years on peace building, human rights advancement, civil society empowerment, and conflict resolution, with substantial field experience in the Middle East and Afghanistan. She is also an adjunct associate professor at Columbia University. Erica, over to you.
Thank you very much. We're also going to share a PowerPoint slide with you so that you can get a little bit more details from this complex review. I'll also be joined by two of our other co-authors and research team. As Bushra mentioned in the introduction, we were very pleased for this youth thematic review that all our key interviews, our key cohorts that Bushra mentioned, were led by youth researchers who are also involved in the field research. So two of those are going to be joining me as co-presenters, Iman Karamu and Louisa Current, later on. But just to dive right in, as Bushra mentioned, this thematic review is commissioned in part for learning on how are peace building projects, how is the Peace Building Fund being used to advance the youth peace and security agenda. To analyze that, we took 41 projects that have been implemented across a number of countries over the last 5 years. These were peace building funding supported projects, but implemented by a number of different partners and also with the cooperation of local government partners and local civil society in a number of countries. The focus for most of these projects, we really wanted to look at the youth participation pillar. So there are 5 pillars within the youth peace and security agenda, and participation is one of them and can be key in implementing some of the other pillars. Although a lot of the projects also had a pretty good focus on conflict prevention, so the prevention pillar of the youth peace and security pillar. Just to note that this is only a small slice of the PBF supported work. PBF's work on in support of youth peace building and youth inclusion has covered all of the youth peace and security pillars. We really had to be very choosy in picking just 41 of them. So to say that that while this thematic review covers a lot, it certainly is only one share of the entire work that's happening right now in terms of youth inclusion and promotion. For each of the analysis, we looked into the project documents for these 41 projects. We analyzed them according to 4 cohorts, which I'll introduce. We covered more than 140 research interviews, including with youth activists, with those implementing these projects, with government partners, with civil society. And we also had field research in 3 countries that had a big focus on youth inclusion. That was in the Central African Republic, the Gambia, and Guinea. And my 2 co-presenters were part of that field research, so they'll be able to share some of their insights from that experience itself. The 4 cohorts, as Bushra mentioned, one was on youth participation in local peace building. The second, looking at national and regional mechanisms. So things like national youth councils, national YPS coalitions, but also things like involving youth in regional conflict prevention or regional peace building. My colleague Louisa is going to share more from cohort 3, which is on intersectional approaches and also some considerations for protection. And I myself led the 4th cohort, which was on youth and climate peace and security. And all of these were interlinked. So we looked at the projects. We had specific projects for each cohort, but also looked across the 33 countries and territories. I won't have time in this presentation to give you the full readout of the findings from each of these 4 cohorts. We have too little time, but instead what we want to leave you with is 5 key messages, 5 key takeaways that we took from the overall thematic review. So the first of these is that we really are seeing that peace building programming is becoming the vehicle that takes forward the YPS agenda. 10 years on from Resolution 2250, There's still many areas that we would like to see more youth inclusion and participation. One of the key goals of Resolution 2250 was to involve youth in all forms of decision making. And an example of that really can be seen within the projects within this thematic review, where youth were really integrated, whether it was in local community councils, creation of, as I mentioned, national youth councils or national parliaments. Some of our speakers and youth panelists who will be speaking after the presentation will share their personal experience of taking part in those initiatives. We've also seen other examples of how the peace building programming has been taking forward the YPS agenda's commitment to involve youth in all forms of peace and security. So, for example, there was a really innovative project in Sudan. One of our youth presenters will also speak to that a little bit later, where youth have been involved in active conflict monitoring. We also observed another project in the Central African Republic where youth were involved in reconciliation and community DDR. Many, many more examples of youth taking part in different forms of the peace and security agenda. And what's important to take away from this is not just the diversity of ways that we're seeing peace building bringing youth into different types of participation, different types of peace and security, but also the overall impact of this. So, and the trends and change over time. Youth has always been an important part of peace building funding programming. We've seen it from its additional establishment within 2006. But then in 2016, shortly after the passage of Resolution 2250, the PBF created what's been called the Youth Promotion Initiative, which was an annual competitive call focused on youth promotion, also open to CSOs and youth organizations to take forward these projects as implementing partners. So to give you an example of the scope of this went from funding $2.7 million worth of programming in 2016 to $30.5 million in the last year of it in 2023. PBF estimates that between 2018 and 2024, across 48 countries and territories, there have been more than $311 million invested towards the implementation of the YPS agenda. And we saw examples of that across the sample, both through that Youth Promotion Initiative Fund, but also beyond it. During our field research missions, the team observed that youth was a key focus in many of the country programs, so well beyond the YPI fund. In Guinea, in the Central African Republic, in Gambia, these were central parts of the Peace Building Fund investment and central parts of the strategy of how peace building could actually contribute to advancing peace within these countries and sustaining peace. So what we heard across all of the programs was that peace building programming can be key in creating entry points for youth to engage, and then also supporting youth to seize these opportunities for participation. So just to conclude, this first point was really seeing peace building as acting as the fuel for taking YPS pillars and commitments from rhetoric to action. My colleague Aman will take up the second and third points.
Great, thank you so much, Erica. A second finding that we found during the study is that really across the different contexts that we've examined and the different projects, we really saw that when young people are meaningfully included in peace and security dynamics, the impact of their inclusion is really immediate and far-reaching. They don't just help resolve conflicts, they really actively transform communities. So across the different projects, we've really seen young people mediate disputes, how they bring fresh thinking to long-standing challenges, and even lead on climate-related peace building. So one of the strongest examples of this was in fact Guinea, where we led field research, as Erica has mentioned. So in some of the high risk areas of the country, implementers set up youth councils to engage young people in conflict resolutions. And these councils quickly became trusted local actors, where young people were able to conduct surveys, mediate tensions, and essentially propose solutions to community challenges. In 18 of the 20 participating communes, mayors really reported a significant drop in the violence. And in one of the towns that we visited during field research, Louisa and I, called Colabri, we talked to one of the mayor, and he really told us about his commune's history, how it saw recurring riots led by young people who essentially felt like they had no real economic prospects, and how often these turned to essentially violence. But when we inquired on the youth inclusion work in the commune, he told us about how transformative that really had been for his area, and how in the 11 months leading up to our visit, there essentially had been no major incident. And what's really interesting is how he credited that stability largely to efforts at keeping young people involved in community affairs, or at the very least keeping them informed about what was happening. So that way, they really felt a stronger sense of civic engagement and of responsibility. But beyond Guinea, we saw that in other contexts. So for instance, in Colombia, during the 2019 and 2020 protests, implementers helped set up youth assemblies that really helped channel those young people's frustrations into constructive dialogue. These assemblies ended up working with local governments, advocating for change on issues like education, unemployment, and over time, they really gained recognition as credible political counterparts, both at the local and at the national level. We also saw this in Chad, where their implementers really helped mend intergenerational tensions and set up a charter that was co-created by young and older leaders, and helped, we really saw how young people really helped rebuild trust between communities and local authorities, and essentially helped strengthen local cohesion. In the Lake Chad Basin, in a project that we examined there, we saw how young people were really central to turning climate challenges into peace-building opportunities. They really led on efforts around reforestation, around resource management, really addressing root causes of conflict while generally promoting environmental sustainability. So really the key point here is that across all these contexts that we've seen, the common thread is that really when young people are included, not just as beneficiaries, but really as partners, they're able to deliver real results, to reduce tensions, build trust, and essentially really drive change from the ground up in their communities. Moving on to the third point is that although we've seen how youth inclusion can be key to many peace building and conflict prevention contexts, what we've also seen is that it can be really slow to develop and meaningfully support. So one of the key challenges that we've identified from talking to the different implementers is that issue of time. It can take time to overcome stigma and mistrust between generations. It takes time to move from simply giving youth a platform to actually empowering them to use it. And so really one of the key findings there is that youth inclusion's efforts we saw how they were more sustainable when they built iteratively. So when each step laid the foundation for the next. We saw this very clearly in CAR, for instance, where we also led some field research. So after the 2019 peace agreement in the Central African Republic, young people were essentially left out of early talks. The original PBF program there aimed to give young people a seat at the table. But it quickly became clear that access alone wasn't going to be enough, because many of the young people that the program sought to involve really lacked the skills to fully participate and be seen as credible interlocutors. So implementers shifted gears, and they shifted the programming to training 750 young people in civic education and leadership and conflict resolution. And it's really that investment that made the real difference. Here, I just wanted to share an interview that I remember from the field visit in Bangui, where I talked to this one woman who was a sociology student who had never done fieldwork before, joining the PBF program. And so she was recruited to go into some of the most volatile districts of the capital city, Bangui, to do some sensitization work around youth violence and just generally raise awareness about the peace agreement. But early on, she turned back to implementers, telling them how she didn't feel fully prepared and how she needed more training. And so after receiving the training, when talking to her, she really told me how the project was really an incredible springboard for her, how it gave her real experience, being able to survey communities, navigate tense situations, and really built up that confidence that she needed to be able to make that sustainable impact. And so her story is just one example of how inclusion becomes meaningful when it's built on a foundation of capacity here, for instance, or where young people are not just invited in, but really equipped to contribute step by step. And so zooming out also a little bit from that individual story, we also saw how that could have a structural effect when programming was able to be iterative. Going back to the Guinea example, it really was a prime example of this kind of iterative programming where one project really quite literally built on the foundations of another. So for years in Guinea, young people were largely shut off of political dialogue. There were ministries in place, but many young people were still seen as threats rather than partners. So when we talked to people there, they told us how it really wasn't surprising to see how that frustration was often spilled over into violent protests. And so implementers there, instead of pushing for immediate national change in this hostile climate, they really started local. So in 2018, one of the PBF supported programs there focused on creating youth councils in some of the most conflict-prone communities in the country, slowly building trust, experience, and visibility really where it was possible. And so when there was a political change in 2021 in the country, it's really that groundwork that paid off and made the difference. So the local youth representatives who had built that credibility over time became sort of the obvious candidates for the national leadership on youth work and youth peace building, and that eventually led to the launch of the country's first national youth council in 2023. So really the key idea here is that iterative and adaptive programming where, each step builds on the previous one was really seen by implementers as one of the most successful approaches because it recognized that change, especially when it's dysystemic, meaning when it engages really wide segments of the population, really needs time and progressive thinking. I'll stop there and I'll hand it back over to Erica.
Wonderful. Thank you. The fourth key point that we want to emphasize is how important it is to put youth leadership at the center of this. So in Aman's discussion, you can already get a sense of some of the different practices and strategies that were tried in some of this programming, including sensitization, spreading positive messages, increasing dialogue and engagement through community activities. But one of the most important best practices that we saw across all 4 of the cohorts was that these projects were the most successful, where they allowed youth to lead and allowed youth to prove themselves and to prove what they could do. And that this was much more effective at dismantling stigmas and stereotypes than simply messaging or communicating, for example, YPS messages or youth potential, that really young people had the capacity to contribute to peace building and conflict prevention. And when they were given the opportunities to do so, they really seized on it and were able to charge initiatives that were very meaningful to communities. So this could range from in Tunisia, where they led community development activities that were very popular, that really gave back to the community. In the case that Iman just mentioned in Guinea, where the youth became really leaders in soothing local tensions, but also became intermediaries reaching out to address other community concerns, for example, with extractive companies. The same was also seen in the Solomon Islands, also there dealing with some of the mining and extractive issues on behalf of the community. And then, as she also mentioned as well, we saw in the Lake Chad Basin cases where it was youth who were taking forward some of the important messages about the effects of climate change, but also pointing to solutions, whether that was solutions in terms of being the first to embrace sustainable industries and practices, or being the ones who were really in a key position to resolve disputes. And what we saw across all of these projects was that where youth took on these roles, it not only helped transform peace building in their communities, but it changed impressions of young people, and it generated new openings for them to actively participate. So, for example, there was one project that was in the Liptako-Gourmet border region of Mali, Niger, and Guinea. Youth organizations were given sub-grants to develop their own community initiatives. Many of them had a link to climate security and environmental peace building. And in some of these communities, youth also took the initiative to establish local councils to raise awareness of these issues, take part in cleanup and environmentally sustainable initiatives. And as a result of the positive impression created by their engagement and leadership, some of these young people were invited to take part in community development planning afterwards. There was another example on the borders of Mauritania and Mali, where young people helped in supporting the delivery of biogas and other sustainability projects, but also worked as messengers of peace between refugee and host communities. And local officials and community elders were so impressed with their engagement and its effects that they invited some of these youth representatives to take part in local council meetings and other community affairs decision-making afterwards. Overall, what we saw again and again was that where youth led the way, it could have catalytic effects by opening up new pathways for peace building and transforming community relationships. I think Aman referenced this a bit earlier, but there was one project in Chad where there was community dialogues that then led to an intergenerational charter that was established, not just to ensure youth inclusion, but also to establish responsibilities for both sides. And what was important about this was it not only, again, gave youth the opportunity to lead and to prove themselves, but it also reset community relationships relationships in a way that had the chance to have forward catalytic impacts. So really reset the relationships within the community and opened up pathways for cohesion. Again and again, we saw this when we were working across all of the projects, that they had catalytic effects, not only for the youth themselves, but also in terms of the broader community, whether that was in terms of financial catalytic effects with these projects being taken on forward, or in terms of really advancing other initiatives and partnerships with governments and local communities. The fifth slide, though, that I want to get to next, or the fifth point, is that while allowing youth to lead is among the most impactful strategies, there are still many barriers to actually realizing this. Sorry, just making sure the fifth slide comes up before I keep going, so you have the visual cue.
We see it.
There we go. Although it is the most impactful strategy to allow youth to lead, there are many barriers to doing this. Socioeconomic barriers can be a major challenge for young people, both in terms of barriers allowing them to participate at all because they need to be seeking jobs, livelihoods, or support, but also because those barriers affect their status. Other challenges that we saw across the programming was, the length of time that it takes to address some of these deep stigmas and barriers. That can be difficult to accomplish within the short timeline of one peace building project. This is why we focus on some of the iterative or sequential programming as potentially one response to it. And then last challenge that came up a lot, especially in our discussions with youth activists and the organizations, is still a perception that there's not enough funding that's trickling down to youth organizations and to youth themselves so that they can actually lead and take this forward. Overall, when we looked across the YPS field as a whole, there's very little tracking of how much funding is actually getting down to youth and to youth organizations. PBSO has actually started a relatively recent but really unique initiative. Since 2022, they've been asking not just to track who the grants go to directly, but then those grants are often subcontracted to other organizations, many of which might be youth organizations or civil society. And so asking those that receive funding to also track that trickle-down effect and how much might actually get to youth CSOs on the ground. It's still an evolving practice. Still more data needs to be collected in order to analyze exactly how much is getting down to youth organizations, but it's a first start in terms of transparency, which itself can then maybe trickle down to more funding overall. Within the PBF projects that we examined, we did find that most cases youth organizations are not the direct implementing partners, but are these sub-grantees. And this is similar to many other UN or large funding sources. We also heard from youth organizations and activists that this is often because sources of UN funding are not particularly accessible to young organizations or to civil society. They might have very cumbersome, very complicated or bureaucratic funding procedures and accountability procedures. Many youth organizations may not be formally registered or formally coalesced, so this remains a major challenge for the field. However, we did also see some examples of new innovation trying to get around this. So several of the projects tried to specifically carve out large parts of the funding for seed funding or for sub-grant initiatives. The one I mentioned in the Liptako-Gorma region that worked with a lot of youth organizations, although not exclusively, was the entire project was designed to be an umbrella for grant initiatives that would go to local civil society and organizations. In particular for the youth organizations, because many of them weren't registered, the project actually built in time to help them receive that registration status. And then also because many of them didn't have established bureaucratic or budgetary procedures to actually work with them on capacity building so that they would not only receive the funds and lead the initiatives, but would then actually improve their skill sets over the course of the project. And many of them did go on afterwards to be able to win their own projects and awards afterwards based on that experience. So those were positive examples. We also heard other funding instruments talk about things like having applications for funding be by video as opposed to by written ones because you found that much more accessible, or other means of streamlining some of these seed funding and grant initiatives. All of those would be really important to see that we start to break down the sort of glass ceiling for funding that still exists within YPS programming and make sure that youth really are able to lead and take these initiatives forwards. Just to conclude, those are our 5 main points, but I do want to offer you just a sample of what's in the other cohorts. We don't have as much time to dig into them fully, but I do invite you to go to the 4 cohort case studies and learn more. These are very important findings. One of them, it was cross-cutting across all 4 of the cohorts, but particularly as an emphasis within cohort 1 and cohort 4, was that socioeconomic components are among the most important within overall youth programming. And this is because these really get to the heart of youth vulnerabilities and barriers to participation, but also because supporting some of these socioeconomic needs can be key to unlocking other forms of participation. This was also a particular theme, as I mentioned in cohort 4, on climate, peace, and security, so it really dovetails with the findings there. What we found overall was that climate, peace, and security and natural resource programming can really be a key area for expanding youth participation. This is in part because issues around natural resources or other environmental issues are often at the core of community decision-making. So inviting youth to take part in these is really inviting them to take part in the most important issues or most salient for many communities and for families and connections. In addition, youth have been very involved in climate, both globally and locally. We saw many cases where initially a project might not have even been focused on youth, but because youth are so interested in this area, because they really get it and are able to bring forward the climate perspectives, they became central stakeholders within it. And then last, because so many communities are really interested in looking at the intersection between land and natural resources or climate and conflict drivers, these really often link to the root causes. It created key entry points for youth inclusion. There was so much interest and enthusiasm for this project that it was easier to bring youth into them than in some other approaches. And then last, we really saw that where youth were brought into these projects, it was really bringing the full circle of making sure that projects focused on climate adaptation and natural resources are really conflict sensitive, that you can't really get there without having youth involved in them. I'll allow my colleague Louisa to share a few of her findings from the intersectional cohort now.
Thank you, Erica. So yes, one of the cohorts looked at youth participation through an intersectional lens. So youth are often considered as a uniform or homogeneous group, which has been criticized repeatedly by YPS researchers and practitioners alike. Not considering other identity markers beyond age may mean that less attention is paid to the specific needs and vulnerabilities of youth. Applying an intersectional lens allowed for projects to better identify who was not included and recognize hidden structural barriers and thus improve inclusivity. It also allowed to go beyond already supported and engaged youth and reach youth from more disadvantaged groups and thus harness the full potential of youth participation. It also helped identify unique entry points and to consider youth as bridge builders. Projects, for instance, in Somalia were built on a premise that young people, and especially young women, could be critical change agents, as they were not as affected by historical grievances, and bringing them together could address intracommunal conflicts. At the same time, we saw that many of the most deeply intersectional projects were also smaller in scale and quite resource intensive. That's because they often required specific accommodations or more time, for instance, to build trust, not just with participants, but also with local stakeholders and communities. Projects focused on marginalized or vulnerable youth can also create additional protection concerns, for instance, by inadvertently exposing their identities to their communities. In the projects we studied, some teams prevented or mitigated this risk by relying on their team members' intimate knowledge of community dynamics or by working with trusted intermediaries. What also really stood out in interviews on protection was the emphasis placed on building a culture of protection and of all team members considering protection as their responsibility in addition to dedicated focal points. It was also highlighted how important it is to have some budget leeway for safeguarding and protection. What we learned for future programming was to tackle the surmountable barriers by being well prepared and by considering intersectionality and accommodation strategies from the outset and from project design phases. Best practices from projects included having checklists to ensure different accessibility needs were met, and for instance, having a repository of accessible venues. Our findings really indicated that recognizing the specific and intersecting identities of the youth involved can enhance the effectiveness of programming. This reinforces the idea that an intersectional approach is not merely a normative commitment, but a potentially crucial factor in making programming more inclusive and impactful. With that, I'll turn it back to Erica.
Wonderful. So just to conclude, and so we can hear from all of our amazing youth panelists and share from their real experiences, the overall takeaway that we want to leave you with is that peace-building programming is actioning and taking forward the YPS agenda. Across the examples we've shared and many more in the studies, we saw that programming helps create space and entry points for young people. It brought them together, helped them organize, allow them efforts to converge and amplify their works. Also to emphasize that these projects were quite strategic. They were often multi-year, sustained efforts, and that they had to be to succeed. This reiterates our third key point, which was that sequential or iterative strategies are essential, really allowing youth to build their capacities and allowing projects to build from foundations or past work. The final point I want to leave you with is that youth programming is not just a normatively nice to have type of programming, but it's really essential to any peace building. The demographic reality in many of the countries where PBF programming is being implemented is that these are many youth majority populations. In some cases, we saw as much as 60% of the population being under 35. This helped put some of the gains, but also the challenges of this programming into perspective. It's not possible to have successful and holistic efforts at conflict prevention, at building social cohesion, or other efforts to broker and sustain peace without allowing and involving young people to take part and really allowing them to drive that work. Our key recommendations are therefore to continue to prioritize youth inclusion and YPS advancement across peace building, to prioritize economic needs and opportunities as key components in this youth programming, to invest in youth leadership, youth organizations, and capacities for peace, to encourage greater funding opportunities for young people and for youth organizations, including through things like seed funding or grant funding, as well as through direct implementation made possible by more accessible barriers. We're short on time, so I won't go into each of the specific recommendations for the 4 cohorts, but I really encourage you to dive into the study. And please don't hesitate to reach out to myself and also to our other youth researchers with any questions or additional comments. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Erica. That was capturing an ocean in a bottle. There's a lot of information there. I'm in the interest of time, I'm going to go straight to our first speaker and leave some of my immediate feedback on your report and perhaps towards the end. I would say that UNU is very, very good at identifying not just lessons, but also best practices. So please do, if you're a practitioner, or if you're a young peace builder, please do look into this report for lots of examples of how things can be done or have been done in the past that have worked or not worked, that can really guide your programming. But if you're looking for true inspiration, then you don't have to look much further. We have 4 young peace builders on the panel with us. So for the first one, we'll introduce you, and then also we have a very specific question. So we're delighted to have with us today Abdullah Ability, who is a Liberian peace builder, youth peace and security practitioner with 6 years of experience in peace advocacy, mediation, and program management. He co-led the establishment of Liberia's Youth Peace and Security Coalition and serves as its co-chair. He's also Vice President for International Affairs of the Federation of Liberian Youth and founder of the Peace Agents Network. Abdullah is extremely passionate about inclusive peace building and believes nothing for youth should be done without youth. So Abdullah, welcome. Thank you for coming to our panel. Now, given your role in the development of Liberia's National Action Plan on Youth, Peace and Security, can you please share what you worked on and how can young people support similar YPS NAP processes in their countries? Over to you. You're muted, Abdullah.
So thank you. Thank you to Bushra and all of our panelists on the call, our young peace builder and the organizer. So Our YPS journey in Liberia is a testament of young people's passion, their resilient commitment, and willingness to localize YPS in Liberia. Although there are gaps, but we make sure that young people understand the 5 pillars of the YPS agenda and how to localize it in our own context. As a young person and co-chair of the Liberia Coalition on Youth, Peace, and Security, my role is mobilizing and coordinating the effective involvement of young people participation in the Liberia Youth, Peace, and Security process and the ongoing development of our National Action Plan on Youth, Peace, and Security. We make sure that the voices of young people are raised and considered, including young women, young people with disabilities, and young people from rural communities. We value youth engagement in all phases of our YPS efforts and consider the development of a National Action Plan on Youth, Peace, and Security as important as its implementation. Decentralizing our youth consultations and information sharing for a collective and inclusive NAP was one of our best practices. We also ensured that young people are not just a part of the YPS process, but they are leading the process. Thanks to the government of Liberia for the political will, UNFPA, UNDP aid, the UN Peacebuilding Fund, the Irish Embassy in Liberia, and the European Union in Liberia for being very supportive to our YPS process. For other countries, I would say young people, despite their differences, must come together to speak up. They must educate themselves about the YPS agenda and engage all platforms available. See the 5 pillars of the YPS agenda as a guiding principle, and you should reflect it in your YPS process and the development of your NAPs. Also prioritize coalition building. It is very powerful, important, and it sustains and scale YPS impacts. Lastly, in Liberia, political will of our government was very important, and we leverage that for ourselves to make sure that we implement YPS. All young people must do the same in their respective countries. Leverage on the political will of your government. Engage them to get their political will. So we have to remember that the YPS agenda is not a government or a UN agenda. It is a youth agenda. It is a young people agenda, and it should be led and driven by young people. Young people should own the agenda. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was both extremely brief, but extremely powerful. Just want to say, I just want to repeat a couple of things. One is YPS agenda is not a UN agenda or a government agenda. It's a young people's agenda and needs to be driven and led by young people. Excellent point that you make. That kind of ownership, learning about the process is important. I think you really connected with the presentation point, that the presentation made, which was about intersectionality. The process in Liberia, as you said, was very much making sure people in rural areas, young women were being included, as well as young people with disabilities. In fact, for those people who want to go deeper into it, if you go online and you look for Liberia's Youth, Peace and Security Agenda, there's actually special sections there as well. What I really liked also about Abdullah's point, which is something that we've learned in other PBF programming as well, and it's important to see that it's being reflected here, is how the national and the local processes were coming together. So it wasn't just something being done nationally and the local people were not connected, or something is being done locally and not being connected to the national processes. So that kind of connectivity is absolutely critical for driving an agenda forward. So thanks so much. And I also think that other countries can take inspiration from both the government of Liberia for their political will and from the young people of Liberia for their drive and commitment. So thank you very much, Abdullah, for your time. We know how busy you are today, so we really, really appreciate your presence with us and for joining us again. I will now move on to our next panelist, who is coming from Sudan. We are very, very happy to have with us Khalid Mishen, who is a Sudanese human rights defender and the founding member and spokesperson for the Youth Citizen Observers Network, YCON, With extensive experience in human rights work, Khalid has collaborated with numerous NGOs and grassroots organizations across Sudan, where he focused on documenting illegal detention, torture, discrimination, and other serious abuses. As YCON spokesperson, he regularly briefs international stakeholders, institutions, and media outlets on the evolving situation in Sudan and the urgent need for global solidarity. Khalid, I think it's absolutely wonderful that you're here and that you're following panelists like Abdullah, because on the one hand, we were looking for how countries where there's relative peace are taking forth the YPS agenda, but you're also an example of how YPS agenda is still alive because young people and their commitment and their passion for their future exists everywhere in the world. So the Youth Citizens Observers Network has done a fantastic job with adapting their work when the war broke out in Sudan, demonstrating how peace-building projects can bear fruit in spite of conflict. Please tell us more about your experience with adaptation and what can young peace builders do when they encounter conflict escalation? Khalid, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for having me, and thank you also for the engagement. YCON, or Youth Citizen Observers Network, has gone through a number of adaptations during its before, even after the war. As we know that Sudan has a very dynamic and changeable context that is always in a regular and continuous changes as a result of multiplicity and division within the civilian and the military. To be more aware about the context in Sudan, the war in Sudan, Sudan is at war since its independence in 1956. All this war used to take place in the peripheries, but April 2023, the current war in Sudan now, was the first war to take place in the capital city of Sudan. YCON mandate in 2019 was to monitor the performance of the transitional period, because after the revolution, after December revolution, we had the transitional government, and then we formed YCON to see how the government was committed to the agenda of the revolution of the youth, of Sudanese youth, and then how they are committed to the agenda, which was the peace, justice, and freedom. But in 2021, during the transitional period, it was not a smooth transitional period because the transitional period was between the military and the civilians. But that period was interrupted by a military coup in 2021. The coup was rejected by the civilians, especially the youth, represented in the resistance committees, where all of us at YCON were members of the resistance committees. YCON at the beginning was a project within the Carter Center, and the Carter Center designed a project named the Fast Track, and the project aimed to revisit the youth agenda by holding a number of meetings with the youth groups, where they discussed the priority, the challenges of the youth, and that project was to adopt the new context because, as I've mentioned, there was a coup, but later YCON became an independent youth body, and then came April 2023 war. And that was the biggest challenge for us as youth in Sudan, not only as YCON members, but as youth in Sudan. A week after the war, we took a decision to monitor the violation committed, and that was the most difficult and important decision we took in the course of YCON journey, because we were not prepared and equipped to monitor the human rights violations. As I've mentioned, our mandate is to monitor the civilian government during that time, but not to monitor the human rights violations in Sudan. We have just suddenly found there was a war, and then we have to go through this process in monitoring the war. Because as I've said, we're not safe, we're not prepared, and also we're not safe at safe place as well. Most of us, and the situation was very complicated and difficult. Most of us lost their job as a result of the war, and we were not paid because WICON was not yet formed. And as an administrative body, because that was our position, we were members of the administrative body, and we were to take WICON to the next steps and not to act as an executive. But that's what's happened. We have just found ourselves that we have to monitor the situations. But the youth were excited and encouraged to tell the world what is happening in their areas and villages, because killing was everywhere. Many were detained, especially those who were members of the resistance committee. Personally, I was stopped twice by an armed group and detained once for 2 days as a result of report found on my smartphone after being recovered by the security when I was leaving the country. And that report was for WICON also. As a WICON member today, I'm very proud of our work, and we're the only people to observe Jeddah Declaration, because after the war, there was a ceasefire declaration in Jeddah between RSF and SAF, and we were the only and the first people to observe these declarations. And every time when I look at the report we released that time, I feel I'm very proud for two reasons. The first reason is because we managed it and succeeded to produce a valuable product with no resources and very low inputs. And the second, because our report and advocacy effort had developed in a very good way, and we were able to brief the UN Peace and Security Council in New York and the Human Rights Council in Geneva, and also the African Commission on Human and People Rights in Banjul, the Gambia, this year. For us, what's happened during the war, we had new mandates, and we had a new context and new challenges as well. We, as WICON, we reorganize ourselves and change the mandate of the WICON to monitor violations and atrocities committed by the warring parties. Instead of observing the civilian government, because as I've mentioned, the point was to observe the civilian government, but we have just suddenly found ourselves that we are observing the war. The challenges, we're not trained, as I've mentioned, to monitor and document the situation, or especially the human rights situation, but we succeeded to do that after conducting number of online training and other trainings on ground where the situation were stable, or they can manage to conduct the trainings. The new challenges and the new mandates. Number one, we had new structure, because as I've mentioned, WICON was not yet formed, and then we have just found ourselves, we need to have the structure, especially the executive office, which you call it the secretariat. And then we became members of secretariat. Beside all difficulties, beside all untrained, not well prepared group of youth, who became members of secretariat, and we started to report on the situations. The observers also was one of the challenges, because we have observers in different areas where the security situations became intense, and also some observers have to leave their areas. The issue of the displacement, the observers have to displace from area to another areas, and then we have the lack of observers, and then we have to deploy new observers in that areas. That was a challenge, but we succeeded to deal with it, because you can have like a area where there is a military confrontations, and you need to observe the situations, and the observers they displace with the people, and then we need to have others in the place. The third was the issue of decentralization, and this is very important point to mention, because Sudan is a centralized state, everything is centralized in the capital city. The government, the services, everything is in the center. When the war started, because as I've said, it's the first war to start in the capital city of Khartoum, and then it is spread to the other regions. When the war started in Khartoum, everything stopped because the services was there, the internet was there, the lines, different lines of the communications was there also, and then everything stops in Khartoum. Then we have to find way to deal with the situations, communication blackout, and also the transportations, everything was stopped, but we managed to deal with the situations beside all this. At the end, I would like to say that I have learned too many lessons from the history of WICON. But most importantly, what I'm going to say is the youth in different countries that witness or might witness a military confrontations in the future must organize against any forms of a military government. The revolution in Sudan was against the military regime because that was the Bashir regime. We revolted against a military regime. Then we had a successful revolutions, but there was an attack on the sit-in the military headquarters by the military. And then all this brought the youth together to act against or to refuse any form of a military regime. That's why when the war started at the youth, we did not find difficulties to monitor the atrocities committed by the warring parties, because we know and we are aware of what this military can do. Until now, we are doing that, and we still keep in producing our reports on monitoring the situations, hoping that this war will stop through our observation efforts and the report that we publish on our monthly and specialized report. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Khalid. That actually, it's such an inspiring narration of real life war and how it can impact people. But what's remarkable is when you're setting the scene and you say there's killing is everywhere, and that's when youth decided to come together to do something about it and to start observing. And the first, one would assume that the first reaction is to be afraid. The first reaction is to withdraw or to retreat. But the fact that the young people came together at great risk to themselves and then organized themselves into a different mandate. I also know from our previous conversations that for about a year, nobody was being paid. This was entirely being done voluntarily. And again, connecting it to what Erica said earlier in her presentation, that the willingness and the passion of young people is there, but sometimes they do need support in skill development, in capacity development. And that's where your group actually also did online training or self-training, or even recognizing, having the humility to say, we want to do this, we are in the middle of it, but we really don't know how to do. And that wisdom in a time of utter chaos and violence and lack of security to say, we want to be able to do this, we're not equipped to do this, let's learn. And that passion to just, when everything else around you is falling apart, to still grow as a group and as individuals, to say, we want to be better at doing what is absolutely necessary for our country. And I really admire, and it really gives us a very realistic perspective at the fact that you were detained for 2 days because of what you had on your smartphone. The fact that the people are being displaced while they're observers. So the observers there's no protection available for observers. They're doing something extremely risky and being displaced because it's a very fluid context. So extremely, extremely powerful. Thank you so much for inspiring us, for continuing to inspire us, and for making Sudan so proud by you and your entire network of young people. So thank you very much, Khalid, for your time with us today and for sharing these lessons. I will now pass on to Sarah Misaudi. who I've had the pleasure of speaking to before. She is the regional lead at the Middle East and North Africa Coalition on Youth, Peace and Security, working on weaving, convening, and catalyzing diverse members and external youth actors to foster collaboration and create opportunities for exchange. Sarah has led, managed, and coordinated different global, regional, local youth-led network structures that actively work to advocate for youth leadership and participation in decision making. She has also served as Youth Advisory Council member at the United States Institute of Peace and has been elected as a MENA representative at the United Network of Young Peace Builders. Similar to Khalid, with his experience of briefing at the Security Council, the Human Rights Council, Sarah has also experience of briefing many important politicians, policymakers, decision makers, including those represented in the Peace Building Commission here in New York. Sarah, many young people aspire to be engaged at a regional or even international level on peace building matters. Given your experience working on YPS in the Middle East and North Africa, but also globally, how do you think young people can contribute to regional or global peace building discussions and initiatives?
Assalamu alaikum and greetings to everyone. I believe absolutely it's not an easy time to talk about peace within these days with everything happening around, with all the atrocity challenging us as practitioners, young peace builders, UN officials, to the core of the mission and the daily operation we do. But I believe it's maybe a time to say now it's more important than ever to belong to these spaces at the regional and global level, because they continue to fuel us and they continue to remind us that we are not alone and that maybe together we can fight this together. And this maybe brings me to the core of the conversation and the question addressed by Bushra is that why I personally believe it is important to anchor these global and regional spaces. And first of all, I would say that the global and regional platform always influence very much the local efforts. And more than that, it gives it legitimacy and power. Because, for instance, when the UN adopted Resolution 2215/2015, it wasn't just a nice achievement. Yeah, it was a youth-led movement that influenced the UN, and the UN adopted the resolution, but it became later a door opener. It became a spark because the resolution became a seed for many bigger things that happened. For example, it gave us a legitimacy to push further. It led to the launch of the Arab strategy for youth peace and security in the MENA region, for instance. Today, many countries are adopting the national action plans, including Tunisia, Jordan, Iraq, and they are developing either national youth strategy or NAPS. But also it led to the formation of many civil society networks and coalitions for YPS, many youth-led coalitions. At the regional level, I am aware of the Europe Coalition for YPS, the Nordic Coalition for YPS. On the national level, I honestly lost count. There are many national YPS spaces and efforts and networks. And this is for me the definition of a movement. Something starts and then it sparks, it emerges. You cannot control what was created or who's leading what. It was creating a leadership space for everyone to show up. And this brings so much legitimacy because as youth activists, even when we travel and we say, oh, we are part of a YPS effort and it's actually a global agenda or it is adopted at the regional level or at the national level, that gives us legitimacy. When we are in ministerial meetings and we are trying to advocate for something, it gives us credibility. So it is a tool that we use that further enhance what we are doing. Second, I believe as well these global and regional platforms, especially networks and coalitions, are shifting the isolation mindset to really collaboration mindset. And this is something that taught me that I really learned so much in the past years, which is real leadership is really relational. Before that, I was focused on doing peace efforts as projects, as initiative 1, 2, 3. But now I become more aware, no, it's really about bringing people together. It's about creating these relationships and nurturing trust. And then things will emerge on their own, even without you controlling it. And in networks and coalition, there is no one single leader or one single person or project manager who says the outcome. It's a space for everyone to hold each other accountable, for everyone to hold each other in collaborative way, and to have a collective achievement. And that's how the movement continued to grow, which I emphasize it so much in the first point, because it's not just about funding, it's also about trust. And real problems nowadays are so much complex. It cannot be solved by one single organization, by one single coalition, by one single network. And power and knowledge need to be distributed, because most of the issues are about as well owning the power. And when we learn to decentralize the power and share the power and resources, it becomes a different mindset. And also, today, with the lack of funding, and I think the cut of funding in peace building, what's happening, we can discover that relationships are actually more sustainable than projects. And collaboration is really now the key takeaway and the key way to actually solve what is happening. The final thing that I would love to emphasize is that in relation to this is that we need to also, when you work within regional and global platforms, you start to see things in systems, and you start to even identify the problems in a different way. Because one big mistake that I see always happening is that we are identifying problems as technical problems. So all of the actors really just see technical solution to adaptive problems that are very systematic and not easy to solve. And hence we are often thinking about capacity building trainings, workshop, toolkits, research, but are we really solving the problems? The problems are so much deep. They are cultural, they are sometimes in the mindset, and it's very important to scratch the surface and identify what is the problem, and that's the adaptive challenge. So we literally don't know the clear solution. We need to understand what is enhanced inciting these issues, and to start to think in system, and to start to think about adaptive leadership and adaptive problem identifying. And this means time. We need time to learn and to fail, and to have courage to fail, and to have courage to test things, and not always think about clear deliverable, clear outcome, clear training, because it is very direct and it's very easy to measure. So the problem usually needs time, and peace is not a project, it is a process. And at many times, it is really a messy process that requires a lot of experimentation. To close with, I would like to say a remark, which is currently nowadays, I believe all of us are exhausted, and especially young peace builders who are on the front line, working as volunteers, navigating shrinking civic space, protection issues, is that we need to protect the passion as well to do peace building work. And we need to systemize this. We need to systemize the hope and passion. It needs to be part of the work. So when we think about our efforts, we don't just think about what is the final output, and that's it. We also need to think about the relationship part that I mentioned, how to nurture energy, how to nurture care, how to nurture really passions. And because the youth participation is not just about being present there, part of the table, influencing this, but it's also part of a whole, and how to sustain them and support them in a way that they are alive with purpose. And I thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Extremely powerful. And I'm so glad to hear that some of the regional and international efforts are not just helping in kind of creating that kind of movement, but also, like you say, making sure that young people know that they are not isolated, that a lot of their efforts, it's a collaborative effort, and we all must come together. Just sitting here, just in this conversation that we are having today, just learning from the Liberia and Sudan, some of the things that others can learn from, and that sense of isolation is reduced for other young peace builders around the world. I also agree that within a peace building fund, and of course within peace building support office, the civil society coalitions and the formation of civil society coalitions is extremely important, and it does help to build a movement. And a little shout out to PBSO's Civil Society Forum, where we actually do say it was interesting that we've never really had such a forum in the UN building before, but there's all these civil societies working for peace building, the peace building, that come together and learn from one another. And that's exactly what you said, that power and knowledge needs to be distributed. It belongs to everyone, and we are all responsible for holding each other accountable, but not just accountable to what we do, but also accountable to being collaborative with one another. And it is indeed the passion of young people that we need to protect. But lastly, even though we say the Peace Building Fund supports projects, but these are not projects that we are supporting. These are interventions to support processes that are ongoing in countries towards peace building. And absolutely the courage to fail, enabling that we learn from failure, we learn from our mistakes. Even this thematic review identifies where things are not working well. And how do you change that? How do we make sure that we don't make the same mistakes again? All of those things are absolutely critical for any kind of increase in knowledge and improvement in practice. Our last panelist today is Engadin Jobe, who works as the Deputy Speaker of Gambia's National Youth Parliament, where she plays a crucial role in amplifying youth voices in national decision making. Beyond her parliamentary role, Engadin serves as the security sector reform focal person at the Center for Research and Policy Development, where she spearheads initiatives to strengthen accountability and effectiveness within the Gambia security institutions, while also working as an advocacy and training officer, leading on capacity building and civil society partnerships. And Gideon, a question for you is about the stereotypes that young people face and the resistance that they face when they're trying to become engaged at national level decision making. What do you think young people, and especially young women, can do to overcome these stereotypes and be taken more seriously?
Thank you very much. And once again, I am very happy to be here to see my fellow panelists, brilliant young people across the continent doing their work on peace and security, and everybody from the UN office. Good afternoon from the Gambia. So, responding to this question, first of all, it is important to establish that stereotype is not only a social phenomenon, it is systematically rooted, especially I'm speaking from the context of the Gambia and at some point at the regional, at the ECOWAS region. It's very systematic. We find it in our local settings, our local structures, our political structures, and so on. As a result, it requires a lot of things to actually combat, especially from the victims that are young women. So it actually takes a lot of work to be done to ensure that stereotype is taken away from here. For example, in the Gambia, when it comes to one of the most important institutions when it comes to peace building and conflict resolution, if our is our elderly settings we call Bulunda and chiefs. It's at community level. It is usually headed by the district chiefs, who is both a traditional leader and also head of the district. Until 2 3 years ago, no woman or young person sits in that in the Bulunda, and at some point we have seen it has become a tool of alternative dispute resolution in our communities. And as young people, we sat as part of our advocacy and asked ourselves if we are not part of these structures that actually build peace and resolute conflict in our communities, how do we participate in the process at community level more so at national level. And as a result, organizations like Activists of the Gambia started the campaign to ensure that at least one woman is nominated into the Bulundas, but eventually also a youth is nominated into the Bulundas. At some point, we do say it's not enough, but there's a starting point for everything. These structures existed for decades of years. These are pre-independent structures, and they have been existing forever. And as such, this serve as a starting point to ensure that young people and women are put into these structures. And one fundamental way to ensure that stereotype of young women is actually combated, especially in the development space, is rejecting tokenism. We have at some point we are the victims, but at some point we also become accomplices of some of these things. If we really reject tokenism, anywhere that we are given position to sit, where we do not carry really the voices of young women and the real voices of young people, but sit on the table just for young women and young people to be counted, I think we should do the honorary thing and leave that table for those it was set up for. And if that, if that phenomenon continue, young people continuously rejecting tokenism, at some point it will bring a sovereign reflection in our societies that if we really need to, if we should really bring them in the table, we should engage them from the beginning until through the processes until the decision making table, where they are also going to represent not only their voices as individuals, but also the voices of the demography that they represent. And I think that is very important and it's very effective. And this happens in very subtle manners. You go to meetings, especially as a youth leader who's a young woman, and they look at the high table and they're like, ah, it's too managed. They can come and occupy this and make it gender balanced. It's as subtle as that. And I'm like, no, it wasn't planned for women to be part of the panel, and I am not going to be. So you reject it at that level. Wherever they see you, they will know if you don't engage again at the planning stage, he is not going to sit at the table just to show that young women are represented, which I think is very important. And in the case of the Gambia, it is very structural that you go to our political parties instead of women and young people to actually be part of the executive of our political parties, they are confined in these structures we call the youth wing of the political party, the women wing of the political party, where only one youth and one woman is selected from each of these structures to actually represent the whole lot of young people in these structures. And in the case of the Gambia, where 70% of our population is young people, evidently it translates into structures such as political parties, such as political structures, and every even social structure. And as such, you have more women and more young people in these structures. However, we are still confined into youth wings, women wings, just to keep us away from the decision making table, which is sometimes hard, to actually make young people and women understand because they think by confining them they're giving them their own space to talk about those issues. And strategic intervention is another intervention and advocacy is another way we can really combat stereotype of young women. And when I say this, for me, it's time we start becoming very intentional about our advocacy. It's about not only saying yes, young people are involved and all that, but beyond that, also, having a special thematic advocacy issue for young women. If young people are all, if the whole table is young people, we should be able to go a step further to scrutinize and ask where are the young women amidst the young people itself as demography, and also ensuring that there are policies to enforce this. I'll give example. When you come to the National Youth Parliament of the Gambia, during the transition to ensure that we have a nationwide structure, it becomes very intentional. We ensure that women are engaged as much as young women are engaged. But on top of that, we also add a layer to reserve 7 seats in the parliament for young women, one to be nominated from every region because we have 7 regions, and also reserve 2 seats for the Federation of Persons Living with Disability, where again, one must be a young woman. So these are the things that we put in place intentionally to ensure that we close the gender gap, but encourage more young people to be part of the decision-making processes, for young women to share their success story, serve as pioneers, as mentors to other young women, to be also able to be part of the decision-making processes, and serving as mentors, bringing more young women to be part of the decision-making table. Just to conclude, like I said the last time, stereotype is not something we are born with as human beings, irrespective of what society we come from. These are things we are socialized to. It can be either through our schooling system, through our cultural settings, through our social settings, and even through our political behavioral socializations. For us as a generation, it was socialized, and we are trying to combat stereotype. And even us as advocates, sometimes we cut ourselves off guard, actually being perpetrators of these stereotypes. And but the important thing is at the end of the day, stepping back, being conscious, because again, like I said, these are things we are unlearning as a generation. The most important thing here is to ensure that stereotype of a young woman stops with us. It ends in this generation. It's a generational tax to ensure that we do not hand it over to the next generation, for the next generation to be free of stereotype, to like Sarah said, to be collaborative, to build relationship across generations, to build relationship across genders, to build relationship across nations, across regions, and at global level, to ensure that our agenda, the youth agenda, is forwarded from community settings to the global meetings and global settings. That is the only way we can attain this. Again, beyond projects, building relationship creates sustainability. That is what we are doing in our countries as young people, and that is what we hope. And international agencies like UN help facilitate for us to also build these collaborations at global level so that we have these conversations for not only conversation's sake, but for them to be influential and create impact for this generation, but more so for the future generation of young people. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was, as expected, extremely powerful. As the deputy speaker, we can see why. Very powerful. I just want to say, as a fund, very often we are asked certain questions as well about, let's say, in some countries, for instance, let's say you're representing the Gambia. And we actually had a question about, why are these local mediation, why is PBF supporting local mediation or conflict resolution efforts? And this is precisely the point that we're trying to make, is what you said, which is that local dispute resolution, it's when you start including young people there, unless they are included at the local level, they will not be able to contribute at the national level. This is a movement that is started from the roots, from the foundation, and then you build into the national and larger systems. Really appreciate what you said about tokenism. Women should not just be given a seat at the table to be counted. And young people are absolutely rejecting tokenism, and they are using their behavior to end stereotypes. Absolutely, it should end with us. It should end with our generation, if not yours. And I also agree, and this is something that just want to highlight, that we are also experiencing this in Peace Building Fund programming, because we focus so much on inclusivity and we always cluster women and youth together. Very often we see that the women are the older women who are generally more powerful in the local landscape. But youth then ends up involving young men only, because for even those who are, let's say, connecting the beneficiaries or making sure that our partners and our recipients are more balanced, they just say, oh, but women are already included in the women pillar, so youth should be young men only. And that's something that we really, really need to change, the understanding. And also, let's not separate young men from young people with disabilities. We need to understand intersectionality. We also need to include everybody. And within young people, we cannot also be seen to create divisions by preferencing one group within young people over the other, because then you are kind of creating this division. And right now, the one thing that young people have is exactly this collaborative intent, this collaborative attitude towards bringing change for each other. And all the examples that we had today is about young people coming together and supporting one another, being collaborative and not competitive with each other when it comes to bringing change for youth and for youth, peace and security agenda. So our many, many thanks to all of our panelists today. We also thank, of course, you and Erica for always holding us accountable, for sharing in this intensive report the lessons learned, the best practices, which we hope all of you will have time to read. Please know that the French and Spanish version of the report is going to be available by the end of June. English one is already online. We also have the cohort papers, the sub-theme papers. So take your pick. There's a lot there that you can choose from. But there's a wealth of information in this document. And we also just want to say that when Peace Building Support Office The reason we focus so much on PBF supported projects is because it enables us to bring in a certain transparency and a lens where we are able to critique ourselves and be able to be fully transparent in saying there are certain things we're not doing well. For instance, what we just said, in working enough with young women in some of our work, we're not doing as well as we could be doing or we should be doing. So there are things that the reason we focus so much on our supported projects is to bring in that transparency. At the same time, we as an adaptive fund are also making sure that to the extent possible, we are learning from monitoring so that we are not just learning after projects are completed and we decide what we did wrong. So for instance, in Latin America, we saw that you cannot be working with young women as much as we tried without working with their families, or in some cases without working with the religious leaders. So our projects had to adapt, allocate certain funds for advocacy with families and other leaders that influence women's participation, and for these young women to be given the opportunity to prove themselves and to be able to break the stereotypes that we have around us. So thank you very much to all of you for coming together again. Thank you, Nagina, for bringing us all together once more and to make sure that this recording is available for everyone. We hope that you enjoyed watching us and that you learned something, and more importantly, that you were inspired by the remarkable speakers we had today. Please do visit our website, un.org/peacebuilding, for more information about the thematic review, and to also follow any past initiatives that we've had, but also any future ones. Thank you and have a good rest of the day.